Before we jump into it, this work is based on Mary Hannah Main's master's thesis and more recent work by Paul Zhang, who couldn't be here because of visa difficulties. And this research was sponsored by the National Science and Engineering Research Council of Canada through a collaborative research and development grant with Synopsys. So let's say you want to deploy image segmentation to the edge. This is challenging because the inputs are complete images and the outputs are basically complete images too. It's very memory and compute demanding. So you go and you say, well, let's try to get it to fit onto this device. And you realize that you can't afford to wait for 100 gigaflops and 40 million parameters. It's just too many. Unfortunately, because you're not one of the big five, you also can't afford to do your own network architecture search. You don't have the resources. You can't train from scratch. So what do? Well, what we propose is to use a state-of-the-art network like DeepLab v3 as a SuperNet, kind of like once for all, but without you having to do that work, and then just subsample the network to look for interesting trade-offs. So we have a technique where we use genetic algorithms, where we encode the architecture of our image segmentation network, the different parts of it that we want to search in a chromosome, perform genetic algorithms to find Pareto optimal options, and have been able to trim 10, 20, 50% of the flops, up to half of the parameters, cut inference latency in half for the small price of a handful of percent in error. Oh yeah, and the most important part is you don't have to do any training. So instead of spending hundreds or thousands of GPU days performing network architecture search, we can do this in half a day on a single GPU. So we did experiments with two different backbone feature encoders using the DeepLab v3 network. The first one is exception. Now, exception is extraordinarily complicated and expensive. And actually, the middle flow, which is a block that's repeated 16 different times, represents about 60% of the computation and half of the parameters required by this network. And this is just from the encoder front end. And so we subsample it. We encode the presence or absence of each one of those blocks as a binary digit in genetic algorithms, and we do very, very coarse grain pruning. So Kristen was talking about weight or filter or kernel pruning. We are chopping off entire big chunks of this network in order to try to reduce the computational complexity. Because we can't afford to do retraining, we're not modifying the structure in any other way. We need to be able to basically remove something and just reconnect stuff. Another way that we can modify the networks without having to do retraining, because we're not creating additional parameters, is just to change the stride. So our exploration for this network looked at increasing the stride in this depthwise separable convolutions and removing blocks from the middle flow, just to see what can we cut without hurting accuracy too much. We also did similar investigation using the MobileNet v2 backbone. MobileNet v2 is a lot more lightweight than exception. It's about 1/10 of the flops and 1/20th of the parameters. Even so, there's some opportunity for further exploration. And again, we looked at the bottleneck layers to see if we could remove some of the layers there without hurting accuracy too much, and again, modifying stride. Because we can just stride the kernels over the feature maps without having to change the underlying weights at all. So we used NSGA2, which is an elitist genetic algorithm, and if you're unfamiliar with genetic algorithms or elitist genetic algorithms, the idea is that you have a population. In our case, it's 12. In many experiments, it might be 100 or so And you look for the ones that strike good trade-offs, and you promote them to the next generation, cross them over, mutate them, and repeat this process. And so you can see, just as an example on the right, in the first generation, a lot of the designs are to the top right. Those are expensive and inaccurate designs, but as the search proceeds, we are able to pull down into the bottom left corner where we have better trade-offs between error and computational complexity in this case. So when we do this for exception, we can dramatically reduce the number of flops and parameters, and we can do so by spending basically half a day on a search, either for one or the other. And it does, as you can see, cost us a few percent in the error, but you can also see, compared to DPC, we're not spending 2,600 GPU days to perform our optimization. For the mobile network, instead of looking only at flops or parameters, we measured execution latency on the GAP8 processor. And we were able to cut execution latency in half, in this case, by looking at changing the stride for different parts of the network, whereas here it was mostly by eliminating different parts of that middle flow. Getting through all this in just 5 minutes is challenging, so I'm happy to talk in greater detail if you have questions. If you want to do image segmentation at the edge, it's challenging because of the memory and the compute requirements. And if you can't retrain, there are other paths. Just pick your favorite network and use it as a SuperNet. If you can figure out how to parameterize the architecture of the model, then it's possible to subsample it, and if you do so judiciously, you can even have good success without retraining. Thank you.